Imagine a tree that has been growing for many generations. Its branches change over time. Leaves fall and grow again. The seasons pass. But deep beneath the surface, the roots remain. Hidden underground, they continue to feed the entire tree, drawing from soil that was shaped long before the newest branches appeared. Families often work in a similar way. What we see on the surface, personalities, choices, relationships, are like the branches of a tree. But beneath them, there are deeper structures, invisible emotional patterns, unspoken fears, ways of relating to the world that were formed long before we were born. Perhaps this is why we naturally speak of a family tree. Because just like a tree, a family grows across generations, extending outward through new branches, while remaining connected to roots that lie far below the surface. And most of the time, the branches continue to grow in the same direction. Patterns repeat. Roles are inherited. Emotional habits pass quietly from one generation to the next. Until, sometimes, something unusual happens. One branch begins to grow differently. A person begins to notice patterns that others seem not to see. They start to question dynamics that have always been accepted as normal. And slowly, without fully realizing it, they begin to change the future direction of the entire tree. Not through rebellion, not through dramatic confrontation, but through awareness, through the quiet decision to stop repeating what has always been repeated. Because sometimes the most powerful change in a family does not begin at the roots. It begins with a single branch that refuses to grow the same way. When one person begins to grow in a different direction, something subtle changes in the way they see the family itself. Situations that once felt ordinary begin to reveal hidden patterns. Conversations that once seemed spontaneous start to follow a strangely familiar rhythm. Reactions that used to feel personal begin to look almost predictable. This is often the first sign that awareness has begun to expand. Not because the family has suddenly changed, but because the person observing it is seeing something that was always there. In many families, emotional behaviors are passed along quietly, without anyone deliberately teaching them. A child learns how conflict is handled, how affection is expressed or withheld, how fear, anger, or disappointment are managed. Over time, these patterns begin to feel natural, not because they are healthy, but because they are familiar. The human mind adapts remarkably well to the emotional environment it grows up in. And once a pattern becomes familiar, it rarely appears unusual to the people living inside it. This is one of the reasons family dynamics can remain unchanged for decades. Each generation learns how to survive within the emotional structure it inherits. People adapt. They adjust. They develop roles that help maintain stability inside the system. Someone becomes the mediator. Someone becomes the caretaker. Someone carries the unspoken anger. Someone learns to remain invisible. And because these roles help the family maintain a certain balance, they are rarely questioned. They simply continue, until awareness enters the picture. And when that happens, something subtle begins to shift. Once a person begins to see these patterns clearly, another question often appears. Why does no one else seem to notice them? What feels obvious to one person can remain completely invisible to everyone else in the family. The same argument repeats. The same emotional reactions appear. The same tensions quietly return. And yet, for most people inside the system, nothing seems unusual. This is not because they are unwilling to see the pattern. More often, it is because the pattern has become part of the emotional environment in which they learn to live. Human beings adapt very quickly to the conditions that surround them. What begins as something painful can slowly become something familiar. And what becomes familiar rarely appears strange. This is why many family dynamics can remain unchanged for years, sometimes even for generations. People adjust themselves to the structure that already exists. They learn how to move within it, how to avoid certain conflicts, how to manage certain emotions, how to maintain the fragile balance that keeps the family functioning. From the inside, this balance often feels necessary, even when it is built around patterns that quietly cause harm. And because everyone has learned how to survive within this emotional structure, the system tends to protect itself. Change becomes uncomfortable. Questions become disruptive. Awareness itself can feel like a threat to the stability the family has maintained for so long. Which is why the person who begins to see these patterns often feels alone in their perception. Not because they are mistaken, but because they are beginning to step outside a structure that everyone else has unconsciously accepted. It was precisely this kind of phenomenon that Carl Jung tried to understand. Jung observed that human lives are rarely shaped by personal experiences alone. Each person is also born into a psychological world that already existed before them, a world of emotional habits, unspoken expectations, ways of responding to fear, conflict, and uncertainty. Within families, these patterns can quietly travel from one generation to the next, not because anyone consciously decides to pass them on, but because children grow up absorbing the emotional atmosphere that surrounds them. They learn how tension is handled, how affection is expressed or withheld, how difficult emotions are avoided, suppressed, or displaced. Over time, these responses begin to feel natural. They become part of the invisible structure of the family. What began as one generation's way of surviving a difficult experience can slowly become a pattern that shapes the next generation as well. In this way, emotional wounds that were never fully understood can continue to echo through the life of a family, sometimes quietly, sometimes for decades. And when someone finally begins to see the pattern clearly, their reaction often surprises the rest of the family. Because the person who questions these inherited dynamics is rarely welcomed as a source of insight. More often, they are seen as the one who is creating problems, the one who is too sensitive, too difficult, too unwilling to simply accept the way things have always been. In many families, this person receives a familiar label. They become the black sheep of the family, the one who does not quite fit, the one who refuses to follow the same emotional path. But what looks like rebellion from the outside is often something very different. It is the beginning of awareness. For many people, being seen as the black sheep of the family becomes a defining experience long before they understand why. They may grow up feeling slightly out of place, not necessarily rejected, but somehow different. Certain expectations feel difficult to accept. Certain dynamics feel strangely uncomfortable. Certain conversations leave a lingering sense that something is not quite right. For a long time, these impressions can be difficult to explain. It may simply feel like a quiet tension between what the family expects and what the person intuitively senses. But over time, that vague discomfort often begins to transform into something clearer. A person starts noticing emotional patterns that once seemed invisible. They begin to question reactions that have always been treated as normal. And little by little, something inside them begins to shift. The familiar ways of responding no longer feel automatic. Old roles begin to feel restrictive. Expectations that were once accepted without question start to feel difficult to carry. From the outside, these changes can sometimes look like defiance. But internally, the experience is often very different. It feels less like rebellion, and more like waking up. What once appeared to be isolated conflicts now begins to reveal a deeper structure. Patterns become easier to recognize. Emotional reactions that once seemed unpredictable begin to follow a familiar rhythm. The person starts to see how certain dynamics repeat themselves again and again across time. And with that awareness comes a growing distance, not necessarily from the people involved, but from the patterns themselves. On this channel, we have been referring to this moment as the Sophia Stage. It is the stage in which perception becomes sharper. Patterns that once operated quietly beneath awareness begin to appear in clear view, and the individual gradually realizes something important. If the pattern can be seen, the pattern does not have to continue. But recognizing a pattern and stepping outside of it are not the same thing. In fact, this is often the moment when the process becomes most difficult, because family systems tend to resist change, even when the change might be healthy. When one person begins to behave differently, the emotional balance that has existed for years can suddenly feel unstable. Roles that once felt predictable begin to shift. Expectations that once seemed unquestionable start to be challenged. And the family system often reacts in subtle ways to restore the familiar structure. Sometimes through criticism, sometimes through guilt, sometimes through the quiet suggestion that the person who is changing has become distant, difficult, or ungrateful. These reactions can be deeply confusing, because the individual is not necessarily trying to create conflict. In many cases, they are simply trying to respond more honestly to what they have begun to see. But honesty can disrupt patterns that have existed for a very long time. And when a pattern has shaped relationships for years, even small changes can feel threatening to those who remain inside it. This is why people who begin questioning inherited dynamics often experience a strong sense of internal conflict. Part of them wants to remain loyal to the family structure they grew up in. Another part recognizes that continuing the same emotional patterns would mean repeating the same wounds. The tension between these two forces can feel overwhelming. Loyalty pulls in one direction, awareness pulls in another, and for a time, the person may feel caught between the two. It is precisely this tension that marks the deeper phase of the Sophia Stage, because awareness alone does not immediately dissolve the old patterns. It simply makes them impossible to ignore. And once something becomes impossible to ignore, a quiet decision begins to take shape. Whether consciously or gradually, the individual begins to move in a new direction, not by attacking the past, not by rejecting the family, but by refusing to repeat what has already been repeated. When someone begins moving through this stage of awareness, the change rarely appears all at once. Instead, it reveals itself gradually through a series of small but meaningful shifts. At first, these shifts may feel subtle, but over time, they begin to transform the way the person relates to their family, their past, and even themselves. One of the first signs is a growing ability to recognize patterns without immediately reacting to them. Situations that once triggered automatic emotional responses begin to feel different. Instead of being pulled directly into the familiar dynamic, the person pauses. They observe, and in that brief moment of awareness, the old pattern loses some of its power. Another sign appears in the way responsibility is perceived. For many years, individuals inside a family system may carry emotional burdens that were never truly theirs. They attempt to manage conflicts that existed long before they were born. They feel responsible for maintaining peace, stability, or approval. But as awareness deepens, something begins to change. The person gradually realizes that not every emotional weight belongs to them. Some responsibilities were inherited, some expectations were assumed, and some roles were adopted simply because no one else questioned them. Letting go of these invisible obligations can feel unsettling at first, But it is also one of the clearest signs that the cycle is beginning to loosen its hold. A third shift often appears in the form of boundaries. Where previous generations may have avoided confrontation or suppressed difficult emotions, the individual begins to respond differently. They may speak more honestly. They may choose distance when certain dynamics become destructive. Or they may simply refuse to participate in conversations that repeat the same unresolved patterns. These changes do not necessarily come from anger. More often, they come from clarity, from the recognition that continuing the same behavior would only preserve the same outcome. Another sign is the way the past itself begins to be understood. Events that once felt confusing or personal start to reveal a larger context. The person begins to see how earlier generations were shaped by their own circumstances, fears, and limitations. And with that understanding comes a surprising shift. Blame slowly gives way to perspective, not because the past was harmless, but because awareness allows the individual to see the pattern without being controlled by it. And perhaps the most important sign appears in the choices that shape the future. The person begins to make decisions that no longer follow the familiar script. They choose different kinds of relationships. They respond to conflict in new ways. They create emotional environments that did not exist in the generations before them. And in doing so, something remarkable begins to happen. The pattern that once seemed inevitable begins to lose its continuity, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet emergence of a different way of living. When people speak about breaking generational patterns, it can sometimes sound dramatic, as if the process were defined by confrontation or rejection. But in reality, the transformation is often much quieter than that. It rarely begins with a dramatic moment. More often, it begins with a shift in perception. The individual begins to see dynamics that were once invisible. They begin to understand how certain emotional patterns formed, how they were maintained, and how they quietly shaped relationships across time. And this awareness changes something fundamental. Because once a pattern is seen clearly, it no longer holds the same authority over behavior. What once felt inevitable becomes recognizable, and what becomes recognizable can eventually become a choice. This is why the person who breaks a generational cycle does not necessarily destroy the family structure. In many cases, they simply interrupt a pattern that had been repeating unconsciously. They respond differently. They create new emotional boundaries. They bring awareness to dynamics that once operated in silence. Over time, these changes begin to alter the emotional landscape of the family itself. Not always immediately, not always without resistance, but gradually, the future begins to separate from the past. Children grow up witnessing different responses to conflict. Relationships develop around greater honesty and clarity, and emotional patterns that once seemed permanent slowly lose their continuity. What is remarkable about this process is that it rarely requires the cooperation of the entire family. Often, it begins with just one person, one individual who becomes aware of the pattern, one person who decides not to repeat what has always been repeated. And although that decision may feel lonely at times, its impact can reach far beyond the present moment. Because when a generational pattern ends, it does not only change one life, it changes the possibilities available to those who come after. Because many generational patterns persist not through intention, but through adaptation. One generation learns how to survive a particular emotional reality. They develop strategies that allow them to cope with loss, instability, fear, or disappointment. Those strategies may not always be healthy, but at the time they emerge, they often serve a purpose. They protect, they stabilize, They allow people to move forward even when something painful has never been fully processed. The difficulty is that what begins as a survival strategy can slowly become an inherited emotional structure. Children grow up observing how certain emotions are handled. They watch how conflict is avoided or expressed. They learn which feelings are safe to show and which must remain hidden. And without anyone consciously deciding it, these responses begin to form a psychological template for the next generation. This is why generational patterns can continue even when no one actively wants them to. People are not trying to repeat the past. They are simply repeating what once helped someone survive. And yet, when awareness enters the picture, something important becomes possible. The pattern can finally be seen for what it is. Not as a personal failure, not as a fixed destiny, but as an inherited structure that no longer needs to continue. This moment of recognition often brings a surprising mixture of emotions. There may be sadness for what previous generations endured. There may be compassion for the limitations they faced. And there may also be a quiet sense of responsibility. Because once the pattern becomes visible, the individual understands that their choices now matter in a new way. The future will not simply repeat itself automatically. It will be shaped by what they choose to do differently. In the beginning, we imagined a tree growing across generations, branch after branch extending outward through time. Most of the time, those branches follow the direction established by the roots beneath them. They grow according to patterns that were formed long before the newest branch appeared. But occasionally, something different happens. One branch begins to grow in another direction. At first, the change may seem small, almost invisible. But over time, that subtle shift alters the shape of the entire tree. The future branches will no longer grow in exactly the same way, because the direction has changed. The same is true within families. Most emotional patterns continue simply because no one has ever stepped outside them. But when someone becomes aware of the structure, the possibility of change appears. Not through conflict, not through rejection of the past, but through the quiet decision to live differently, to respond differently, to create a future that is not entirely governed by the emotional patterns of the past. And very often, the person who begins this change is the one who once felt like the outsider, the one who was seen as difficult, the one who was called the black sheep. But sometimes, the black sheep of the family is simply the first person who could see the pattern clearly enough to step beyond it. And in doing so, they do something remarkable. They do not only change their own life, they change the direction of the tree. And once that shift begins, another transformation often follows. The person who once carried the emotional weight of the family slowly learns something new. How to protect the clarity they have discovered. How to stop absorbing patterns that no longer belong to them. How to create boundaries strong enough to support a different future. If you would like to explore what this next stage looks like, you may find it in another video on this channel. After the Sophia stage, your boundaries become unbreakable. Because once someone sees the pattern clearly, learning how to protect that awareness becomes the next step in the journey.